My name is Daryl Riersgard. I would like to start with a general positive statement that I was very proud to be a Marine pilot for many, many years. Some of the best years of my life. Served with some of the most adventurous, likable guys I've ever had a chance to meet. And that is something that I have flashback on, even though it was 43 years ago that we were in combat. The experience then and even when I flew afterwards was the best experiences of my life, the best job I ever had. This all started for me, I think, as a farm boy up in North Dakota. It was a hot August night, or hot August afternoon, about 110 degrees. I'm topping haystacks for my dad down in this big meadow. And for some reason, I glance off to the east and I see a dot on the horizon. And I concentrate on that dot. And that dot's coming right at me, and it turns out to be a fighter jet. Actually, it was an old F-105, and that jet went by the same height as the haystack, which is about 15, 20 feet off the ground. And the coolest thing happened. The pilot was probably about 25 yards from me, and he does one of these, and I'm waving like crazy. And I'm thinking, that looks a lot more fun than pitching hay. And at some point, psychologically, that got into my blood, and I guess the next thing, I'm in college, and about 1966, I get recruited from a classmate named Robinson. He's already in the Marine PLC program, and he says, what are you going to do? You know, the war's knocking. I said, I don't know. I've been thinking about it, but I don't know what to do. He said, you need to get in the PLC program. So next thing I know, he's got my hand. I got the paperwork signed, and I'm on my way into the PLC program. So we did the normal summer camp, OCS, and made it through all that. A lot of the guys I served with in Vietnam actually went the same route, so that's fun to look back at that. Anyway, I survived the OCS training, survived the last couple of years of college, graduated in December '68. And I remember that the Marine Corps was in such a rush that my graduation was actually about 10 days down the road. And the Marine Corps said, we need you now. I said, well, I'll see you after graduation. They said, no, we'll see you now. Here's the train ticket. You're going to Minneapolis in the morning. So went to Minneapolis in the morning, got commissioned, sworn in. Next day I'm in Pensacola. The day after that I'm in flight school. So it went pretty fast. Thanks to my parents, somebody picked up my diploma or my graduation certificate. And at that point, it's fast track flight school. I kind of felt like it was in over my head a little bit. I'm competing with Naval Academy graduates, Purdue graduates, and I'm thinking, geez, I'm just a small college boy. Hope I can keep up. And I did. Probably the fondest memory of Pensacola was the day that our flight went out and did carrier quals. No problem, smooth as could be, like a bunch of old pros, even though we're only probably 19, 20 years old. And I remember the flight leader coming back, who turned out to be one of my really best friends, and we're good friends today. As he got to the 180 and it's time to turn in for final, Terry goes, 3 down and locked, got the program knocked. And that kind of symbolized the confidence that we had at that point. From there, we went to helicopter training. I loved helicopters immediately. I loved the instructors. I felt that they were much more level-headed, likable guys. Some of the jet jocks were a little bit too egotistical for me, but the helo guys I liked. And by the time I had to make a choice, you go in fixed wing, you go in jet, you go in helicopter, the decision was real simple. I liked the mission from what I talked to the guys that were my instructors. So from there it was to the West Coast, did the fleet transition. Again, the speed of getting through was very evident. I remember that the syllabus called for 2 night flights in the CH-46, but they said, no, you don't need that. You need to just get going. You need to get overseas real quick. As I thought later, I could have used some night training in the 46 because my first night mission was actually in combat, so I was kind of kicking myself that I didn't demand my rights. But anyway, from college through flight school, through fleet transition, it was really push, push, rush, rush, let's get you going. For time perspective, remember it's late 68 at this point when I graduated. Tet had occurred, and there were a fair amount of casualties. Nobody had broken the news to me that helicopter pilots probably had the highest casualty rate of anybody, but I'd learn that later, and that's okay. So from fleet transition, we jumped on the Big Bird, went across the pond. A couple days in Okinawa. Next thing I know, we're flying into Da Nang. We weren't in Da Nang off the airplane 10 minutes before bullets were going through some of the corrugated metal, and I'm thinking, boy, this didn't take long. But everybody just puts their head down, and we get on the bus, and I think we're on our way to Marble. Next morning, we're at group admin saying, okay, which pilots are going to which squadrons. I think there were 8 of us in our batch. And they said, well, what squadrons do you want? All 8 of us said Purple Foxes, because the word was out. They said, well, we'll get some bad news. You can't all go to the same squadron. So let's draw straws. And I thought, well, we'll see how lucky I am. John Staples drew the right straw. I drew the right straw, and I forget, I think there was a third one. The other 5 had to go somewhere else, and they were disappointed, and I was happy. So I've had a good stretch of luck all along, and that day was another stretch of luck because I really felt fortunate to be in that squadron. Probably by the time I tell my story, you'll understand better. So from there, it was lickety-split, find a hooch, get on the schedule, and start learning from the old savvy lieutenants. And of course, most of the pilots were lieutenants. There were some token captains and a couple majors and 1 lieutenant colonel, but the lifeblood of the squadron was clearly young, savvy, talented, really good stick pilot or good stick lieutenants. I was like a sponge on those early flights. I didn't get to do much, sat on my thumbs, kind of watched the action. Certainly if there were bullets flying, it took the stick away right away. But you start picking up the little pointers, and you pick up a few pointers from this pilot and a few pointers from that pilot. And pretty soon you're not the greenhorn that you were on day one. As I recall, we had to do about 6 months of co-pilot torture before we were eligible for hack check. And in that first 6, I don't know if I said 6 weeks or 6 months, but first 6 weeks, I'm still invincible at this point. Nothing bad could ever happen to me. I'm a Marine lieutenant. I'm tough. I have the right mental attitude, and everything is going to be in my favor. Probably on about the 5th week of serving as co-pilot, which would have been the 27th of October, 1970, I'm sitting in the co-pilot seat, and we'd made a series of medevac pickups. I think we had about 5 to 7 medevacs on board. And I'm flying with Gary Denton as the aircraft commander. And we're over a hill 270 south, and in my estimation, Gary had the stick, but I think we came in way too hot and too high. And for some reason, we're 250 feet or more above the zone, and I'm thinking, boy, this is really uncomfortable. I'm looking down, and that zone's a long ways away. And for some reason, Gary backs up the helicopter a little bit, which made me feel even more uncomfortable. And about that point, I could hear the ping, ping, ping of rounds going through the helicopter. For some reason, I pushed the stick forward because I didn't like the aircraft attitude going backwards. And I didn't take control of the aircraft. I just pushed the stick forward, and it kind of leveled out the helicopter. About that time, there was a loud bang. There was an explosion over by the right stub wing on the helicopter, followed immediately by an intermesh of the rotor blades. That's not a very good feeling. I do distinctly remember it being an intermesh because I could see one of the rotor blades coming off the left side, and it went off into the distance. At the moment, my thought was, that's kind of like a boomerang. I wonder if it's going to come back. Well, at that point, I also thought, ooh, this is going to hurt a lot. because we had transitioned from a shiny CH-46 helicopter to a 26,000-pound rock. And we quickly hit the ground on the southeast side of 270 South. We hit so hard that the aft rotor system came off, and I was knocked unconscious on that first impact. I remember waking up as the helicopter was roller coastering down the side of the mountain, and I think we had been rolling probably about half a mile, maybe a little bit more, and there was a pile of rocks about as big as this hotel room, and we just plowed right into that pile of rocks, and the lights went out again. So I'd been knocked out twice in a matter of about a minute, probably. Crawled out. Helicopter was all on fire. I was the first one out. The corpsman was the second one coming out of the cruise door, and he was coming out of a fireball. And at that point, we're pulling guys out. Most everybody's waking up at that point. And we got all the medevacs out. We got the whole crew out. At this point, the only one still sleeping through it is the pilot. And Gary was totally out. And the helicopter had rolled over on the co-pilot side. So even though it was on fire, we were on top opening up that emergency hatch. And for those that don't know Gary Denton, I think he played football at Georgia State, and he was a big boy. And it took about 3 of us skinny guys to pull him out of the cockpit. And only then did Gary start coming to. By this time, we realized that the guys that shot us down at the bottom of the hill were shooting at us. The good news is there was a Marine unit on top, so there was a good crossfire going on. And we kind of did roll call and started dragging bodies up the hill. Everybody's alive, but a lot of people were messed up. One broken back, one guy had a broken leg, or had a leg actually amputated at the knee. And the hillside or mountainside was wet, and it had grass on it, and it would be 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. So it took a long time to get to the top. And the Marines came off the top and were actually pulling us up the last few steps. So much for being invincible. That was about the end of my helicopter days. Shortly thereafter, I had my hack check. I was lucky. My hack check was with one of my heroes, Major Dwayne Jensen, one of the coolest guys in the world, one of those guys who never aged. We hated to see Dwayne at the reunions because he was always the same age the rest of us, looked older. We were about 25 minutes into the hack check. I'm flying, as it should be. We get into a tight little zone, picking up some Marines, and hear that sound again. Ping, ping, ping. I looked over at Dwayne and said, "Okay, you got it." And Dwayne looked at me and said, "No, I don't. It's your hack check." So I finished that mission. We got out of there quickly. We picked up our guys. But by this time, I was feeling a little bit of that Marine lieutenant cockiness and started flying mostly hack missions. I was a little bit miffed after a couple months in the squadron because I noticed some of the senior officers mysteriously got sick or got headaches when it was their turn for medevac, which meant that the lieutenants got to fly that mission for them. But I figured out, well, that's just the way the real world is working. And I think in addition to getting cocky, we got a little cynical at the same time. I looked at some of Pat's questions. I remember there was two questions that miffed me a little bit. What was your happiest moment, and what was your craziest moment? Or what was your saddest moment? On the humor side, I've never seen such good graffiti as in the shithouses, and I regret that I didn't write down every single one, but it was some great stuff. There were some real artists coming up with this stuff. I don't know if that's what combat does to you, but there were a lot of chuckles in the shithouse. I also remembered when the Nang Dask used to call for a radio check, some of the cockier lieutenants would say, the Nang Dask read you loud and obnoxious. And I always thought that was really funny. I also thought it was funny when we were at the old club, had too many drinks in us, and the 53 pilots would come in. We would yell out, "Dimmer, Dimmer, how'd you like to kiss my ass?" And there's a long story behind it, but the Dimmer pilots, the 53 pilots, didn't have to land in hot zones, so we did. So we would take it out on them at the old club. It was all good fun, but those were some of the funnier moments, but one sticks out, and it's a little longer story. Probably about my third month into combat, one of my Cobra buddies was shot down and killed. And you never know, what do you do when you lose your buddy? So what do? You stay up late, you have a few more beers, and you tell stories about the guy who's no longer with you. So probably around 2:30, 3 in the morning, we're still hard at it, drinking hard, commemorating our long-lost friend. And there was a colonel from the group staff, I won't mention his name, but he came in, started throwing his rank around and pushing guys, saying, "Knock it off, party's over, time to go home." And he'd done a pretty good chest shove on me. And I guess when you're young and cocky and got 16 beers in you, it's probably not a good idea for somebody to push you. So I waited a few seconds, and I went over and I cold cocked him. And I put him right on his back, and that kind of made me feel good. So at that point, the party was over. We all went back to our hooches. A couple hours later, we're briefing. Actually, I never made it to briefing. I was at breakfast, and somebody said, "Hey, Colonel Stedman needs to see you immediately." I said, "Well, I'll be done with my breakfast here shortly." He said, "No, immediately." So I got up from my breakfast, went to see Colonel Stedman. He said, "You know, you're in a little bit of trouble." And I could figure out what that was all about. So Colonel Stedman said, "There's a meeting at the group CEO's office. So you and I have to go up there." So we went up, and the group commander was chewing me out for being totally out of line and for being drunk and obnoxious. And in the course of the first 5 or 10 minutes, the colonel that I'd punched out was also there. And he was talking funny because his jaw wasn't working real good. But he wanted me to be hanged by sunset. But the group commander said, "Boy, I think we're going to send you home just to show you who's boss here and show you some punishment." And I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, I'll accept that punishment. And then somebody on the group staff said, "I don't think that's a good idea, sending him home from combat as punishment." And there was a long, silent pause there after that. And Colonel Stedman said, "Well, since Lieutenant Riersgard worked for me, I'll figure out an appropriate punishment, and he and I will go deal with that right now." So he got me out of there. We went back to his office, and I said, "Well, what's up, sir?" I didn't really know what was in his toolbox of punishment. He came over, put his arm around my shoulder, and said, "I'm going to give you some advice. Next time, be more careful." Well, that was my punishment. And I've been a Colonel Stedman fan. Before that, that really cemented it. And to this day, I'm still a Colonel Stedman fan. So that was kind of, I wouldn't call it a humorous moment, but it's kind of a crazy moment. And that's always kind of stuck out in my mind. The people in that group staff didn't know what to do with me, but Colonel Stedman did. So there was also a question about what were your sadder moments in Vietnam? And I had two that stuck out. I forget the recon colonel's name. It might have been Leftwich, but I'm not sure. There was a CH-46 rescue mission at night in bad weather in the caissons. And the game plan was apparently for a spy rig to be dropped down into the jungle. And these recon Marines were in trouble and they needed an immediate rescue. Colonel Leftwich could have gone back to sleep and let somebody else worry about it, but Colonel Leftwich was a squared away guy, a real hero's hero. And he went out on that flight as part of the rescue mission. And I believe they actually got the recon Marines on the spy rig, and they were coming up. But I think when they came up, the helicopter went into the soup. And I don't know what really happened, and I'm not sure anybody knows. But needless to say, the helicopter crashed, killed all of the crew members on board, killed Colonel Leftwich, and killed all the poor recon guys who were stuck on that spy rig. I just really thought that was a sad story, and especially the fact the rumor was Colonel Leftwich would someday be commandant. He was so squared away. So somebody else got a shot at commandant because Colonel Leftwich didn't make it through that night. That was one sad story. Another sad story was on the 20th of February, 1971. We were doing what was called Lam Song 3, which was the last push into the tri-border area, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and Laos. And it really wasn't a Marine Corps mission. It was an Army mission. But the Marine general felt left out. So on that particular mission, or that particular morning, the commanding general wanted to go up to Khe Sanh to sit on the brief, just out of curiosity, I guess. Well, before we took off, a team of war correspondents came into the ready room and said, "Can we hitch a ride?" And as you recall, we frequently flew with war correspondents. But since the tri-border raid was classified, we were told no passengers. And I had to tell Larry Burroughs and the rest of that crew, "I'm sorry, normally I could fly you, but I can't take a day." And Larry says, "I know, I understand. Not a problem. I'm going down the road. I'll get on one of these South Vietnamese Hueys." And he said, "I'll see you up there." So we did our brief. We took off. I dropped the commanding general off, and he said, "Just go up and get up to a safe altitude. When I need you, I'll call you back." So while I'm flying around, I get a call from whoever the controlling agency was and said, "Are you available for a look-see?" And I said, "Yes, I'm available." They said, "There's a report of a Huey wreckage on fire near the Laotian border. Can you see if there's any survivors?" So I went down and I made a low pass. What was left of the Huey was about this much. You could see the rotor shaft, but nobody was climbing out of that fireball. Whoever was on board was still on board, and they were all dead. I didn't really know the significance of that crash until I got back, and I heard on AFAN radio that Larry Burroughs, Henry Hewitt, and I forget the other two names, considered to be the top 4 war correspondents of the war, had all perished in that helicopter. And I thought, boy, if they'd been riding with me, they'd probably still be alive. So for those who don't remember Larry Burrough, he was a Time Life photographer. He had a lot of stuff in Time Life magazine, including a real special series on a Marine crew that actually made the cover of Time Life. But some great war correspondence. I've since read the book called Lost Over Laos, and Larry Burroughs' son went back to try to find the crash site. I could have bet a month's pay that the crash site was about 2 miles on the South Vietnamese side of the border, but the border wasn't marked, and our maps weren't that good. They have since confirmed by looking at the serial numbers on the cameras that that camera was purchased at the camera store next to Larry Burroughs' apartment in London, which confirmed that they did have the right crash site. When I read the book and saw the map, to my surprise, the crash site was 3 miles on the Laos side of the border, just to show how confused it was where you were. So much for staying inside the border. Anyway, I made it home that day with the commanding general. We were fine, but that was a sad day. I pondered that story a lot, and especially when I reread the book about Larry Burroughs, written by his son and another author. So I guess those were some of my crazier moments, happier moments, sadder moments. I did miss a fair amount of combat flight time. When I got shot down, I also got shot through the calf and shin, and I was grounded for about 6 weeks before the flight surgeon decided, well, you're okay. You can get back in the cockpit. I also left Vietnam a little early because I had the good fortune of being the embark officer. another Hank Zedman, thank you very much, sir, story. What that meant, they were sort of decommissioning some of the helicopter squadrons, and most of the guys were going over to other squadrons, but Bob Stocker and I got to be CO of troops and XO of troops. I'll get to the troop story in a minute. But by being the squadron embark officer, I had to load up the USS St. Louis with whatever gear wasn't handed off to other squadrons. So I think I got about a 2-month cut going home. I always thought being XO of troops would be a pretty cool deal. And the troops were already on the St. Louis. It wasn't until Bob and I were already on board that we found out that the 200 troops we're in charge of were prisoners, federal prisoners. They were going to Fort Leavenworth. Well, needless to say, this was a rowdy crowd, pretty much out of control. And Bob and I were using our creative minds trying to figure out how to keep these guys from mutiny on the Bounty. And we did, but it wasn't a pleasant ride home. And of course, coming home wasn't very pleasant either, because the military guys coming from combat were outnumbered about 100 to 1 by sympathizers and war protesters and all that. So, we're kind of sitting ducks. Our haircut made it pretty clear, even if we weren't in uniform, that we were Marines. And we suffered a fair amount of abuse. And, it wasn't until many years later that our fellow Marines started saying, "Welcome home, Marine," but that was quite a while after we got home. So that was my combat time. What I really liked about being in the Purple Foxes, it was a lively group. We had a great commanding officer. But probably most important, we had a great reputation. And one of my buddies in the squadron, who later transferred to Wing Intelligence, noted that when the frag requests for missions would come in every night from the ground units, more cases than not, those frag requests had a request at the bottom. If possible, could you assign this mission to HMM 364? Well, they liked the fact that we came early, we stayed late, and oftentimes we stayed until the job was done, even if it meant that you were dodging bullets for a few minutes. And they saw that patch on the back of the helicopter. For many years, I guess it said "give a shit," and that was special to us. And "give a shit" was in positive terms. We did give a shit, and we were willing to stay long and work harder to protect our ground brothers in the field. But one day, I think we had a new commanding general. He was out on the flight line, and he looked up and said, "What does that mean?" And the crew chief was trying to explain it. Then he must not have done a very good job, and he said, "Tomorrow, I want that all gone. None of that give a shit. It needs to be erased." So what do you think appeared on the logo the next morning? Give a shit was gone. Instead, it said, "We don't anymore." So our Marines had a way of doing their digs. So I think after that, it probably went to G period, A period, S period. And I think when that general left, it probably came back to the good old days. So the fact that the Marines on the ground liked the Purple Foxes meant a lot. And I think all that did was perpetuate the reputation, which meant for the rest of us who started out as newbies FNGs, I think it was a lesson to us that we had a reputation to live up to, and that was part of the fun. I think, Pat, one of your questions had to do with fear. And I think one of the problems with being 21 and being through Marine Corps training is you don't have much fear. The only fear I ever remember was when that ping, ping, ping sound started. We would pucker up and look for a very reasonable exit as soon as we could get the Marines on board. But I don't remember, trembling with fear. There was one story that I forgot to tell, and there's been some thank you and acclaim, and that was the fact that I headed up the cruise book during my segment in Vietnam. I don't even remember how I got tasked with that. But once I did, it was a fun project. And of course, part of it was that everybody in the squadron, from highest rank to lowest rank, had to have a photo. And then there were group photos, and then we put people by sections and pilots and hydraulics and avionics and so on. That was a fun project. And in all fairness, Mark Boom realized that I had my hands full. Mark did a lot of photography assistance. Actually, at one point, we didn't have any ground photos. So Mark went out on a ground mission to take some ground photos, and whoever took him out forgot to pick him up and bring him back. And when we got back that night, Lieutenant Boom is missing and actually had to go back and pick him up. So Mark will remind me of that story many times. Almost died because somebody forgot him. But the cruise book was a fun project. We're all older, grayer, and a little heavier now, but it's fun to look back and see all of us skinny lieutenants and lance corporals, and tried to do tribute. Colonel Stedman was acknowledged in there, and our sergeant major, and we tried to do it right. There was one other story I forgot. When I got shot down in October 70, somebody at 95th Evac said, "Do you want your parents and your wife to be notified?" And I thought, hell no, they're already scared enough. Why would I tell them that I got shot down? I've been telling them that flying is safe, it's fun, anybody can do it. So that would kind of ruin the story. Well, as I mentioned, I took a round through the calf and the shin, and I hadn't told my wife. So when I did appear at Hong Kong on R&R, at some point, obviously, the trousers have to come off and the wound has to show. And my wife points at my shin and said, "What's that?" So I had to break the news. Well, at that point, the wound was healing up fairly well. So I got in a little trouble because I didn't tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, but eventually I did. This will be my final postscript story. Pat said I can share it because it involved the President of the United States, so make an exception here on add-ons. I only had 2 opportunities to fly to Laos. One was on the mission with Larry Burroughs, and the other one was a resupply, actually taking long rations to a Marine unit that was at or near the Laotian border. Nobody was quite sure. All I could tell was that it was going to be a long flight with no gas stops in between. So I had to plan this thing well and not dilly-dally around. As it turned out, when we did find the Marines, it was off the map, which meant that I was on the Laotian side. And that was no big deal. We dropped off our supplies, and they had some captured weapons that they threw on board, and we took back. The interesting part of the mission, though, was coming home. Two things were interesting. On the flight home, I'm watching the gas gauge and feeling a little bit bored, so I turned on the ADF Armed Forces radio. And as luck would have it, President Nixon is doing his State of the Union address. So I'm listening attentively because I'm trying to figure out what the hell's going on in Vietnam, so maybe he'll tell me. But he made a statement that caught my eye, or caught my ear rather. He said, "My fellow Americans, I can tell you at this moment, there is not a single sailor, soldier, Marine, or airman serving outside the border of South Vietnam." And I thought, you stupid son of a bitch. Either you're lying or you don't know what's going on, because I just came from the other side. Well, the other part of the mission that was interesting, after Windbag had finished talking, I'm getting closer to Marble Mountain, but I'm noticing that my fuel gauges are getting really low. So I did as I was taught. I off-balanced, so I had more fuel on one side than the other. And this flight is starting to take a long time because I'm really fixated on my fuel gauges. As luck would have it, on short final, I'm doing my 180-degree turn, and I have a flame out on one engine, which is no problem because I'm light. The airstrip is right there. And I make a nice safe landing, and I'm taxiing off. I get off the runway, get on the first left turn, heading back to the revetments, and the second engine flames out. So I guess that's about as far as you can go with a 46 before you're in serious trouble. So that's my last story.